Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Dungeonland for PC and Mac. This is a very interesting genre-defying game that professes itself as a cooperative action role-playing game, but it's not a role-playing game. And it's not really an action game either. It's not a MOBA either, but it plays more like one. So, it's kind of hard to really put this into one particular genre. It's a mixture of a lot of different things. And the closest thing I can really say is that it would be considered maybe an action strategy game. Regardless of whatever bizarre genre it was developed by Critical Studio and published by Paradox Interactive, and first released in January of this year. Although, it was later re-released as a free-to-play game. Now, that begs the question, why was it released as a free-to-play game? And to be honest with you, I still haven't really understood that particular move. Because when I got this game, it was before it turned free-to-play, and then it turned free-to-play, and it didn't seem to be really all that different, apart from having more monetization in it. So, the ultimate question is this interesting mashup of genres actually a really fun game, or was there really a strong reason that it turned free-to-play? Well, as far as presentation goes, it does run in the Unity engine, which means a couple of things. The first is that if you crank this thing up to the absolute maximum visuals, for some bizarre reason, the performance tanks. But if you run it on high, it doesn't really look all that different, and suddenly runs a lot better. I don't really know why. That's just the way Unity engine works sometimes. Just depends on how well you optimize it, I suppose, but that is an issue. That said, the visuals really aren't all that impressive from a quality standpoint. They do look in a lot of ways decidedly amateurish. There are quite a few blocky-ish looking models. There are some jagged edges here and there. The texture work isn't amazing by any stretch of the imagination. But it doesn't look bad, and part of that is because they chose this bright, colorful, cartoony-looking art style that really does fit the game very well, and it's very obvious that they didn't really take themselves all that seriously when designing this thing. And that extends on into the sound design as well. Lots of really hilarious voice acting from the Dungeon Maestro, as it's referred to. You even have a laugh button, and whenever you press it, you get this evil cackle going on. The monsters themselves sound suitably wacky. The heroes sound rather goofy, and everything works really, really well as far as the choices of sound effects and voice go. The music is this interesting combination of fantasy and what you would expect from, say, a carnival. So it also fits the game very well, although the music itself isn't really all that impressive. So ultimately, the presentation is very, very fitting for this game. It's just nothing particularly impressive. But obviously it doesn't really matter, the story and the gameplay, although there's no story at all in this game, so it actually doesn't matter at all. Instead, it falls entirely to the gameplay in this particular case. So, what is the gameplay like in this particular game? Well, it depends on who you're playing. If you're playing as the heroes, you choose one of three classes: the mage, the rogue, or the warrior. Each of those have their own specific subclasses. For instance, the rogue has the assassin, the gunner, and the archer. Each of these subclasses determine what weapon you're going to be using, as well as what your character's special ability is. And of course, you can also select perks that will give you some passive bonuses as well, like additional damage, for instance. And so, what ends up happening with the heroes is that you have a party of three, and you run around, you kill monsters, you defeat the spawners, and the basic objective is to get to the end of the Dungeonland, which is this theme park style dungeon. It's rather silly, and defeat the boss. You also want to make sure that you do not run out of collective lives. The entire party has a life pool, and once those lives are depleted, the party loses. So that's how the Dungeon Maestro actually wins. Whereas the heroes basically just need to survive. Now, whenever a hero gets downed, he can get revived, as long as one of the other team members actually gets up there and manages to help them up. But you're going to be swarmed by monsters while you're doing this. Now, when you're actually playing as a hero, most of the stuff is pretty simple. You're just going to be using your basic attack as well as your special ability to just mow down as many monsters as you possibly can, and generally try to defeat the spawners, get to the next checkpoint, get to the end of the particular stage of the Dungeonland, move on to the next part. You'll be collecting loot along the way, and unlike, say, in a MOBA, where you want to pick up as much loot as possible for yourself, you actually get this loot in a collective sense. As in, whatever one person picks up, everybody gets it. So you don't really need to worry about being competitive in this case. It is entirely cooperative. Playing as a hero is pretty simple, but where it gets more interesting is when you're playing as the Dungeon Maestro. Now you see, as I mentioned, the way you win as a Dungeon Maestro is for the heroes to run out of lives. How do you facilitate this? Well, within each dungeon there's going to be a set amount of monsters and different types of monsters that are just around, and you will get these cards that you can use to spice things up. To actually use these cards, you need mana. Your mana is represented by small spheres at the bottom of the screen, and once they're filled up, once you get a certain number of them, you can use whatever card you have that has the amount of mana that you can muster. For instance, if you have 4 mana, you can use a card that requires 4 mana. Pretty simple thing. Each of these cards can be very different things. For instance, you can spawn monsters, or you can maybe spawn a trap, or actually call in some sort of special attack upon the foes. And you even get access to a laugh button. Why? Because you're evil. You're the Dungeon Maestro. You're supposed to be evil. You're cackling maniacally. And this is where it really does get fun, because that's when you're trying to defeat the heroes as badly as you possibly can. Because believe it or not, it's actually pretty hard to take down the heroes unless you're playing on a high difficulty, in which case the heroes take extra damage. So higher difficulties are way better for the Dungeon Maestro, whereas lower difficulties are way better for the heroes. Generally, you'll try to find a balance, for instance, the normal mode or the plain easy mode, where it's certainly possible to defeat the heroes, but it gets harder and harder the closer you get to the easy side of things. So once you get to normal, that's about where it becomes very, very, very difficult for the Dungeon Maestro to actually win. Now, the Dungeon Maestro can also possess monsters on the field and use them as, for instance, a hero would be used normally. But most of the time you're going to be using those cards that will just be given to you sort of at random, and they are generally replenished whenever you get to a new checkpoint, whenever the heroes make it to a new checkpoint, I mean. And so you'll mostly be using these cards. Eventually, if the heroes manage to get to the end of the dungeon, then you'll actually take control of the boss monster, and you'll be able to use them pretty much as a hero, except having a lot of abilities as opposed to just a single ability. Now, believe it or not, the boss fights in this game are actually really, really easy as the heroes, because it's actually just not all that hard to take the boss monsters out. They're slow, they don't really have all that many really powerful abilities. Unless you're playing on a high difficulty, they don't really pose all that much of a threat. So it's something that sounds really awesome. For instance, playing as the Mind Squid. That sounds pretty awesome, this gigantic Cthulhu-like creature. And yet, he's actually rather pathetic. It's kind of depressing, actually. And so, the Dungeon Maestro is the more fun of this part, but unless you're playing it on a higher difficulty, the Dungeon Maestro is going to have a hard time. Unless you're playing on a lower difficulty, the heroes are going to have a hard time. But generally, it's actually more fun to play on a harder difficulty, regardless of whether you're playing as a hero or as the Dungeon Maestro. Because obviously it makes the Dungeon Maestro's job a bit easier. He's not going to have as much frustration from trying to take out the heroes. Whereas the heroes have to work harder to actually win, and thus it actually poses a challenge. And it doesn't feel like you're just slogging through a bunch of mindless hordes that pose absolutely no threat to you. So you have to strike a balance there. Now, there are issues. It is a bit laggy online, and there's not really a big player base. And I haven't even talked about the monetization of this game. Now, you can buy things with actual money in this game, but when you play the game, you will get gold coins. You can use these to buy all sorts of cosmetic items. In fact, all of the weapons, the different armor suits and such like that, those are entirely cosmetic. They have absolutely no bonuses or detriments whatsoever. There are other things you can buy with the gold, but this is all in-game currency. And pretty much everything you can get with gold is just exclusively bought with gold. So there's really no pay-to-win aspect of this game. The part where you actually end up buying things with real money is just for additional content, basically. So they actually have handled the monetization of the game fairly well, even though the game does end up being kind of grindy, because you do use those coins to unlock new cards as a Dungeon Maestro, as well as the various subclasses for each of the 3 main classes, things like that. So it's a rather grindy game in the long run, because it does take you quite a while to earn enough coins to actually get some of these things. So, what is Dungeonland altogether? Well, it's a cool idea. It's a weird mashup of genres. It's certainly got a good sense of humor about it. It's very self-aware, constantly making jokes, constantly making fun of its own absurd concept. Good art style. The gameplay is very easy to pick up. There aren't all that many technical problems. It does have some performance issues here and there, particularly if you're playing on the highest settings. But if you set the settings down a bit, you'll be fine. There are some lag issues online, and part of that is because it is a peer-to-peer game. But for a free game now, and keep in mind, this was released as an actual retail product at one point, but now it's a free-to-play game. So, ultimately, I say, this is really a game that's meant to be played with friends. It is definitely a multiplayer game. There is a single-player component, and that's what you've been seeing in this video, just because it's easier for me to record that without any major repercussions from playing online. But you really do see where this game would be at its best when you have a group of friends and you are all just goofing off in the game, and you're making comments on things that are happening, you're working as a team, that sort of thing. And one of you is playing as the Dungeon Maestro and is being all devious and constantly throwing insults and such at his buddies who are playing the heroes and stuff like that. You can see where that would be really, really fun. But if you're just running into it and basically playing it in pub lobbies effectively, it's not quite as fun as it probably should be. So it's a really odd game. In the long run, there is fun to be had here, but it's certainly not for everyone, and it certainly has issues. And it could also wear thin very, very quickly. So ultimately, I'm going to give this a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.